Ethan Reynolds had always believed that comfort meant happiness. He had built a steady life, a quiet home in suburban Ohio, a stable marketing job, and a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. But lately, everything felt like a movie he'd seen too many times. The same early mornings, the same tired dinners, the same words repeated out of habit instead of love. His wife, Claire, was kind and responsible, but they had stopped really seeing each other. Conversations had turned into reminders, grocery lists, bills, chores. Even laughter had become rare, replaced by the dull silence of routine. It was a gray Friday afternoon when the first spark appeared. Rain pressed against the office windows as the team gathered in the break room. Coffee cups clinked, and the tired laughter of the week filled the air. Ethan leaned against the counter, his mind already at home, planning another quiet weekend. That's when she walked in Melissa Jordan, the new creative consultant. She was confident but not loud, stylish but not showy, with a calm energy that drew people in. She was the kind of woman who seemed to carry her own light, as the group joked about weekend plans. Melissa looked at Ethan with a teasing smile and said, "You look like a man who forgot how to breathe. Come on, Reynolds, take 5. Let's grab a coffee downstairs." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a casual dare. Ethan smiled politely, about to refuse, but something in her voice made him pause. 5 minutes, he said finally, almost surprising himself. They stepped outside. The air smelled like rain and fresh pavement. The coffee shop across the street was warm and cozy, the kind of place where strangers talked easily. Melissa ordered a cappuccino. Ethan got black coffee. They sat by the window, and for the first time in months, Ethan didn't feel like an invisible man in his own story. Melissa wasn't like anyone at the office. She asked about things that didn't involve deadlines or marketing reports. "What do you actually love doing?" she asked. Ethan thought for a second, realizing how long it had been since someone had asked him that. "Photography," he said finally. "I used to take pictures everywhere, road trips, little things that caught my eye. I guess I just stopped, then start again," Melissa said, her voice soft but firm. "Don't let life turn you into someone who only works and sleeps." Her words hit him like a quiet truth. He hadn't realized how much he missed being himself. The version of Ethan who noticed sunsets, who made Claire laugh, who believed that love was an adventure. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost that man. They talked for half an hour, though it felt like 5 minutes. When he returned to the office, his coworkers teased him, but he just smiled. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was just coffee. Just a conversation. But something about that small moment stayed with him. The sound of her laugh. The way she listened like she actually cared that night. At home, Ethan tried to tell Claire about it, not about Melissa, but about wanting to live again. "Maybe we should plan a little trip," he said. "Just us. Remember those road trips we used to take?" Claire barely looked up from her phone. "We'll see," she said. "Work's been crazy. Maybe next month." He nodded, trying not to feel disappointed. But when he lay in bed later, her phone still glowing beside her, he stared at the ceiling and thought about Melissa's words. "Don't let life turn you into someone who only works and sleeps." The following week, Melissa passed by his desk and said, "Still thinking about that 5-minute break?" Ethan grinned. "Maybe I should have taken 10. "Careful," she said with a playful look. "You might start enjoying life again." It became a small routine. A quick chat at lunch. A shared laugh over bad office coffee. Melissa was easy to talk to, and Ethan found himself looking forward to those small moments. Not because of attraction, at least. That's what he told himself, but because he felt seen. Claire, meanwhile, was distant, without meaning to be. She was working long hours, stressed about bills, family, and everything in between. She didn't notice the small changes in him, how he smiled at his phone when a message came in, or how he started dressing better for work. She just assumed he was trying to look more professional one evening. While working late, Ethan and Melissa sat side by side going through slides for a presentation. The office was quiet except for the hum of the computer. Melissa leaned back and said softly, "You're too good to be living half a life, Ethan." He turned toward her, unsure what to say. The way she said his name felt personal, too personal. Too personal. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two people who hadn't planned to cross a line but suddenly found themselves standing on its edge. Ethan broke the silence. "Maybe I just forgot how to live fully." "Then remember," she said, smiling faintly, "take 5 again. For yourself this time." That night, Ethan drove home through the rain, the radio playing softly. He thought about his life, not what it was, but what it used to be. When he walked inside, Claire was folding laundry, exhausted. She smiled briefly. "Hey, you're late." "Long day?" "Yeah," he said, hesitating. "Just a lot of work." They talked for a bit, but neither really heard the other. They were two good people slowly drifting apart, and neither wanted to admit it. Days turned into weeks. The 5 minutes became a quiet connection, a friendship filled with laughter, shared stories, and small looks that said more than words could. They never touched, never crossed a physical line. But something emotional had started, something both thrilling and terrifying at home. Ethan started taking out his old camera. He'd walk around the neighborhood, taking pictures of empty streets and fading sunsets. It felt like breathing again. Claire noticed once, "You're into photography again?" she asked. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's nice," she replied without looking up. It was such a small moment. But it felt huge, a reminder of how distant they had become. One morning, as Ethan poured coffee in the office kitchen, Melissa appeared beside him. "You look lighter," she said. "Happier." "Maybe I am," he said honestly. She smiled. "See what happens when you take 5? He laughed. "You should stop saying that. It's starting to sound dangerous." She tilted her head. "Maybe that's the point." Her words lingered long after she walked away. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He knew he was walking a line, and yet he couldn't bring himself to step back. Melissa wasn't a mistake. She was a reflection of what he missed. Excitement. Conversation, being seen. But guilt followed close behind. He thought of Claire, of their quiet home, of the years they had built together. He loved her, he did. But love, he realized, wasn't always enough to keep people connected. The next day, Melissa invited him for lunch outside the office. "Just food," she said with a grin. "No rules, no guilt." 5 minutes, right? He agreed. They talked about everything, dreams, regrets, the strange ache of growing older. Ethan found himself opening up more than he had in years. She listened without judgment, and for that hour, the world outside didn't exist. But as they walked back, something changed. Melissa stopped and said, "You don't have to say it, Ethan. I know." He looked at her, startled. "Know what?" She smiled sadly. "That this means something to you, too." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call it harmless, but he couldn't. Because in that moment, it wasn't about romance or betrayal. It was about feeling alive again that night. He came home to find Claire asleep on the couch, the TV still on. He covered her with a blanket and stood there quietly, watching her breathe. He remembered the girl who used to dance in the kitchen, who used to make him laugh until he cried. He whispered softly, "Where did we go?" But there was no answer. He knew something was changing, something he couldn't fully control. And though he hadn't crossed a line yet, he could feel the pull of it. It had all started with a dare. "Take 5, she'd said. And he did, but 5 minutes had turned into something much deeper. Something that would soon test everything he believed about love, loyalty, and himself. The following week came with unexpected warmth. The air in Ohio carried the first signs of spring. Soft sunlight, the smell of wet grass, the sound of life returning. But inside Ethan's heart, there was a storm. He tried to convince himself that what he shared with Melissa was nothing, just a friendship that made work more bearable. Yet deep down, he knew it was something more dangerous, an emotional escape at home. Nothing seemed different, but everything felt different. Claire still greeted him with her usual tired smile, still talked about her long hours at work, still fell asleep early with her laptop on the bed. But now Ethan felt a quiet distance growing, like a wall that kept getting taller between them. He wanted to talk to her, to tell her he missed them, but every time he tried, she was distracted or too exhausted to listen. So he stopped trying. Work became his refuge. Melissa was there, bright, alive, always saying the right thing at the right time. She noticed the little things no one else did. When he changed his haircut, she smiled and said, "That's better. You finally look like yourself again." When he stayed late, she brought him coffee without being asked. It was small gestures like that, simple, harmless moments, that made Ethan's heart ache in ways he couldn't explain. One Thursday afternoon, as the office emptied, Melissa came to his desk holding 2 paper cups. "You owe me lunch," she said. Ethan laughed. "For what?" "For saving you from that terrible coffee you always drink." He grinned and gave in easily. They drove to a small diner just outside town, a quiet place with checkered floors and old rock music playing softly in the background. It felt strange sitting there with her, away from the world they both belonged to. For the first time, they weren't coworkers. They were just 2 people, talking like they'd known each other for years. She told him about her past, how she'd been married once, young and hopeful, and how it ended when they both realized love wasn't enough without honesty. There was no bitterness in her voice, only calm acceptance. "You learn," she said. "You learn that sometimes the person who breaks your heart teaches you who you are." Ethan listened quietly, thinking about his own life. He thought of Claire, the woman who had once been his best friend, his confidant, the one who believed in him when no one else did. And yet, somewhere along the way, they had stopped learning each other. When Melissa asked, "Are you happy?" the question hit him harder than he expected. He didn't answer. She didn't push him to. Instead, he looked out the window and said softly, "You don't have to be lonely just because you're loyal." The drive back to the office was quiet. Ethan couldn't stop replaying her words in his head. He wasn't doing anything wrong, at least not yet, but guilt had already started to whisper. That night, Claire noticed something different about him. "You seem distracted lately," she said. He forced a smile. "Just tired." "Work's been intense," she nodded, believing him. She didn't ask more. And that silence hurt more than any argument ever could. Days passed. Their connection deepened in ways words couldn't describe. They started working late more often, sharing jokes no one else understood, finishing each other's sentences. It was never physical, not once. But it was intimate, emotional, and real. Sometimes that kind of closeness is more dangerous than anything else. One evening, after a long meeting, the 2 of them ended up in the parking lot, standing beside their cars under the soft yellow lights. The air was cool, the world quiet. Melissa looked at him and said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" He looked down, unsure how to respond. "Every day," he admitted. She stepped closer, her voice low and calm. "You don't have to keep pretending, Ethan. You deserve to be happy." He met her eyes, and in that moment it felt like the world had paused. There was nothing romantic said, nothing inappropriate done, yet the silence between them was full of unspoken feelings. He could feel his heart racing, his mind screaming to turn away. But before he could speak, Melissa broke the moment with a soft smile. "Good night, Ethan." He watched her leave, his chest heavy with emotions he didn't want to name. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his car outside his own house, staring at the porch light Claire had left on. The woman inside had been his home for years. And yet, he felt like a stranger knocking on his own door. He thought about the early days, how they used to cook together, stay up late talking about their dreams, laugh over small things. Those moments had faded slowly, quietly, until only memories were left. When he finally went inside, Claire was asleep. He kissed her forehead, whispered goodnight, and promised himself he would fix things. But he didn't know where to start. The next morning, he walked into the office, determined to put distance between himself and Melissa. But when he saw her smile, warm, genuine, understanding, all his resolve melted. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Sometimes silence says everything. Weeks passed, and their connection became something they both depended on, not for passion, but for peace. Ethan found himself confiding in her about things he couldn't tell Claire. She listened without judgment, and for the first time in a long time, he felt heard. But it wasn't one-sided. Melissa had her own loneliness, her own quiet heartbreaks. They became each other's safe place, to people standing in the wreckage of their own separate lives, finding comfort in the understanding they couldn't find elsewhere. Then one day it happened. A Friday afternoon. Rain again, just like the first time. They were reviewing a project together in her office when the power went out. The world went still, the hum of the computers fading into silence. They both laughed at first. But then, in that dim light, something shifted. Melissa looked at him and said softly, "You remember the first day we talked? When I told you to take 5?" He nodded. "Yeah, hard to forget." She smiled sadly. "I think we both took more than 5 minutes, didn't we?" He didn't answer. She took a deep breath. "Ethan, I don't want to be the reason you regret your life." He looked at her, guilt heavy in his chest. "You're not." "Then go home," she said gently. "Go fix it." He hesitated. "And what about us?" Melissa smiled, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "There shouldn't be an us, not like this." Before he could say another word, she turned away, pretending to look at her laptop even though it was still off. That evening, Ethan drove home in silence. The rain fell harder, blurring the lights outside his windshield. For the first time in weeks, he didn't think about Melissa's laughter or her voice. He thought about Claire, about the promises he had made years ago when love was new. When he entered the house, Claire was sitting by the fireplace, her face tired but kind. "Hey," she said softly. "You're home early." Ethan sat down beside her, unsure where to begin. "Claire," he said quietly, "do you ever feel like we lost something?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I think we both did." It wasn't anger in her voice. It's just truth. And that truth hit harder than guilt ever could. Ethan wanted to tell her everything about Melissa, about how close he had come to crossing a line, about how he'd almost lost himself chasing the feeling of being seen again. But he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, "I want to fix this. I want us back." Claire's eyes softened, but there was pain too. "Then you have to let go of whatever's standing between us." He nodded slowly, and that's when he realized letting go wouldn't just mean ending something. It would mean breaking the comfort of what had become his escape. He went to bed that night with 2 truths. Echoing in his mind, he loved his wife. But he had also found something real, even if it was wrong. The next morning, he woke up early, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the gray sky. He thought about the dare that started it all, 5 minutes. That had changed his entire world, and he knew that the real test wasn't about what he felt. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be next. Ethan woke up the next morning with a heavy calm. The world outside his window looked peaceful, gray sky, quiet streets, soft drizzle tapping on the glass. But inside him, everything felt unsettled. He knew what he had to do, though part of him wished he didn't. He couldn't keep living in 2 halves, one loyal, one lost. Melissa had been right. There shouldn't be an us. And yet ending it would mean saying goodbye to something that had felt real, something that had made him feel alive again. He sat at the kitchen table long after Claire left for work, his untouched coffee going cold. He looked at his old camera sitting on the counter and realized how much had changed since he'd picked it up again. Taking pictures had reminded him of who he used to be, hopeful, curious, alive. But it wasn't Melissa who had given him that. It was the memory of feeling seen. And that was something he needed to find within his own life, not outside it. That day at the office, everything felt different. Melissa avoided him at first, busying herself with meetings. Their usual rhythm, the small smiles, the inside jokes, was gone. For the first time in months, Ethan felt the silence between them as something necessary. Around lunchtime, he finally walked to her office. She looked up when he entered, her eyes calm but tired, as if she'd been expecting this. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," she replied. There was no anger, no sadness, just understanding. He sat across from her and took a deep breath. "I need to say this, and I don't want to say it wrong. You've been more than a friend to me. You reminded me that I was still a person who could feel things, who could care about life again. But if I keep this going, I'll lose more than I can handle." Melissa nodded slowly. "I know." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "You didn't deserve to be part of my confusion. I'm sorry." She smiled, small, sincere. "Don't be sorry for being human. You just got lost for a while. We both did." Ethan swallowed hard. "You told me to take 5. Maybe now it's time for me to take one more to go home, for real this time." Melissa's eyes softened. "Then go. And don't look back unless it's to remember what you learned." They sat in silence for a moment before he stood up. It wasn't dramatic or painful, just real. Two people letting go with quiet respect. Before leaving, he said, "Thank you for everything." Melissa nodded. "Go make it right." And that was it. No tears, no promises, just an ending that felt like a beginning of something better. That evening, Ethan drove home through the fading light. He passed the same streets he'd driven countless times, but they looked different now, brighter somehow. He realized how easily we forget to notice the beauty in everyday life until someone reminds us. He didn't need Melissa to do that anymore. He needed to choose it for himself. When he walked into the house, Claire was in the kitchen cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and butter filled the air. She looked surprised to see him home early. "You're home before sunset." "That's new," she said with a half smile. "Yeah," he said, hanging his jacket. "I wanted to be." She nodded and went back to stirring the pan. He stood there for a while watching her, realizing how many evenings he'd walked right past her without noticing this simple grace in how she moved. How much love lived quietly in her small routines. "Can I help?" he asked suddenly. Claire looked up, amused. "Help? Since when do you cook?" He smiled. "Since today." She handed him a knife and an onion. "All right, Mr. Chef, let's see what you've got." As they cooked together, the tension that had filled their home for months began to ease, little by little. They talked not about bills or chores, but about random things. The neighbor's new dog, a show they used to love, an old vacation memory. It felt simple, ordinary, but sometimes ordinary is exactly what's missing. After dinner, they sat on the couch quietly watching the fire flicker. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The same woman who had been by his side through everything, who had built a life with him. "Even when things weren't easy, Claire," he said softly, "I haven't been the man you deserve lately." She turned to him, her expression wary but calm. "You've been distant, yeah?" "But I figured it was stress. Was more than that," he said honestly. "I lost myself. I started forgetting what mattered. But I want to change that. I want us back." She studied his face for a moment. "Ethan, I don't need grand promises. I just need you to show up again. That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded, feeling both relief and guilt. "And that's what I'll do." She smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "Good, because I missed you." For the first time in months, they hugged. Not out of habit, but out of something real. And that hug felt like the first breath after a long storm in the days that followed. Ethan worked on rebuilding what he had neglected. He put his phone away during dinners, took Claire out for drives, and brought back his old camera, suggesting they go to the lake one weekend so he could take pictures again. Claire agreed, and for the first time, her eyes lit up the way they used to at work. Things were different too. He and Melissa stayed polite, professional, but distant. It wasn't awkward, just quietly respectful. They both understood what had been and what it needed to become. One afternoon, while walking past the break room, Melissa looked up from her coffee and smiled at him. "Taking 5," she said with a small grin. He smiled back. "Yeah, but this time, I'm taking it home." That was the last real conversation they ever had, and it was enough. Months passed, and the tension that had once filled Ethan's life faded away. He and Claire grew closer again. Not perfect, but better, more honest. They started planning trips, laughing more, remembering what it felt like to be teammates instead of roommates. Ethan realized that love wasn't about constant excitement. It was about choosing someone again and again, even when it wasn't easy. One evening they sat by the lake where they'd gone in their early years together. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Ethan lifted his camera and took a picture of Claire as she laughed at something he said. When he looked at the photo, he felt peace, the kind that comes from knowing you almost lost something priceless. But didn't. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're smiling like you used to," she said softly. He smiled wider. "Maybe I've finally remembered how." She took his hand. "Don't forget again." "I won't," he promised. That night, as they drove home, Ethan thought about everything that had happened. The coffee shop, the rain, the laughter, the guilt. It had all started with a dare. Take 5. 5 minutes that had almost changed everything. But in the end, it had led him back to where he truly belonged. He realized that sometimes life gives you moments not to tempt you, but to test you, to remind you of what's real, what's worth keeping, and what's worth letting go. Ethan never saw Melissa outside of work again. A few months later, she moved to another branch. On her last day, she left a small note on his desk. It said, "5 minutes can change your life. Thank you for proving it can also save one." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet, not as a memory of temptation, but as a reminder of redemption years later. He and Claire would look back at that time as a turning point, the quiet, unspoken chapter that almost ended them, but instead made them stronger. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was honest now, and that honesty was worth everything, every so often. When life grew too heavy or routine tried to pull him back into that gray stillness, Ethan would step outside, take a deep breath, and whisper to himself with a small smile, "Take 5." Only this time, he didn't need anyone else to tell him how. The rain had been falling since morning, washing the world in silver gray. The sound was soothing at first, but as the hours dragged on, it became a dull reminder of how silent the lake house had grown. Claire Walker stood by the tall window, staring out at the vast water that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The lake shimmered faintly beneath the storm clouds, calm and cold, like her marriage had been for months. Daniel, her husband, had left 2 days ago for a business trip to Seattle. He had kissed her goodbye in a hurry, the same distracted way he'd done for years now. There had been a time when his touch lingered, when his eyes carried warmth. But now, his presence, even in memory, felt distant, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Claire had told herself that this trip would give them space to breathe, to reset. But deep down, she knew that space was exactly what had been growing between them for years. The lake house had once been their escape, a place filled with laughter and long summer evenings on the porch. Now it was just walls and echoes. She had come here to clear her mind, to remind herself that she still had one. The fire crackled softly behind her, and she wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Then a sound, a knock, sharp, sudden, and completely out of place. Claire froze. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The main road was barely visible through the trees. She waited, thinking she had imagined it, but the knock came again, firmer this time. Echoing through the quiet house, she hesitated, her breath catching. For a second, the storm outside seemed louder, pressing against the windows like a warning. Slowly, she walked to the front door and peeked through the small window. A man stood on the porch. He was drenched from the rain, his coat clinging to his shoulders, hair plastered against his forehead. His eyes, tired but alert, lifted when he noticed her shadow behind the glass. He stepped back slightly, raising his hands in a small apologetic gesture. "Sorry to bother you," he said loudly over the rain. "My car slid off the road. I've been walking for miles. I saw your lights. I just need to get warm for a bit." His voice carried no threat, just exhaustion and honesty. Still, Claire's heart thumped fast. Letting a stranger in at night in the middle of nowhere wasn't something she'd normally do. But the way he shivered, the way his lips trembled with cold, she couldn't turn him away. She opened the door. "Come in," she said cautiously. He stepped inside, shaking the rain off his coat. "Thank you," he breathed, his tone heavy with relief. I didn't think anyone lived out here." "Most don't," Claire replied, watching him closely. "The road gets bad during storms." Smiled faintly, his teeth chattering. "I noticed." She handed him a towel, then pointed toward the fireplace. "You can warm up there. I'll make some tea." He nodded gratefully and crouched near the flames, rubbing his hands together. The warmth seemed to bring color back into his face. He looked to be in his mid-30s, maybe a little older, with kind eyes and a faint scar across his jaw that made him look rugged. "Not dangerous. I'm Ethan," he said after a moment, glancing over his shoulder. "Ethan Cole." "Claire Walker," she replied, pouring hot water into a mug. "You picked a terrible night to be driving." "Yeah," he said with a quiet laugh. "But it's the best place I could have crashed." She handed him the tea, and their fingers brushed. The moment was small, but she felt it. The house that had felt so cold just an hour ago suddenly seemed alive again. They talked cautiously at first. He told her he was a photographer traveling to capture the autumn landscapes for a magazine. His car had spun out near the bridge, and when it wouldn't start again, he decided to walk until he found help. Claire listened, intrigued by the calm rhythm of his voice. He noticed details about everything: the shape of the raindrops on the glass, the way the lake caught flashes of lightning like silver veins. It was the kind of attention Daniel had stopped giving to anything long ago. "You live here alone?" Ethan asked after a pause. "Not always," Claire said. "My husband and I used to come here together. He's away on work." Ethan nodded slowly. "It's a beautiful place. Peaceful. Sometimes too peaceful," she murmured. Their conversation drifted into silence. Outside, the storm grew heavier, wind howling across the lake. Inside, the light flickered gently against their faces. Claire found herself studying him, not with attraction, but with curiosity. There was something steady about him, something unguarded. After a while, he leaned back in the armchair, eyes half closed, his expression softening as the warmth settled into his skin. "You must think I'm crazy," he said quietly. "Showing up like this? I think you're lucky I was still awake," she replied with a small smile. He smiled back, that kind of slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I guess so." The power flickered, and for a second, the house went dark. The fire glowed softly in the blackness, throwing their faces into faint golden light. Claire's heart beat faster, not from fear, but something else she couldn't quite name. When the lights came back on, Ethan's gaze lingered on her, almost studying her the way he might study a photograph. "What?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's just, you seem like someone who used to love this place, but doesn't anymore." His words hit her like a quiet truth. She hadn't realized anyone could see that so quickly. "I used to," she said, her voice low. "We both did." He didn't push her to explain, and that silence, that simple acceptance, was strangely comforting. Later, when she offered him a blanket and a place to sleep on the couch, he thanked her sincerely. "You've been kind to a stranger," he said. "I won't forget that." Claire nodded. "Good night, Ethan." She turned off the lights and went upstairs. But sleep didn't come easily. She could hear the faint sounds of the storm, the crackle of fire, and the steady rhythm of someone else breathing downstairs. The house felt different now, not haunted by loneliness, but filled with something unspoken. She thought of Daniel, wondering if he'd even noticed she was gone from home. She thought of how long it had been since someone had simply looked at her, not as a wife, or as part of a life they once built, but as a person still capable of being seen. When she finally drifted off, it was to the memory of Ethan's quiet voice saying, "You seem like someone who used to love this place." The next morning, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spilled across the lake, making everything glimmer. Claire came downstairs to find Ethan standing by the window, his hair still messy, but his eyes brighter. "Morning," he said. "Your view's even better without the storm." She smiled faintly, handing him coffee. "You're seeing it on a rare good day." "I don't know," he said. "Last night didn't seem so bad either." There was a pause, gentle but loaded with something neither could define. He reached for his jacket. "I'll try to get my car towed this afternoon," he said. I'll be out of your way soon." But as he said it, there was something in his tone, a softness, almost like he didn't want to leave. Claire felt it too. She should have told him goodbye right then. She should have let the story end there, a night of kindness between strangers. But when he stepped toward the door, he stopped. "Claire," he said, hesitating, "would it be all right if I came back later to thank you properly? Maybe bring dinner." She didn't know why she said yes. Maybe it was the way his eyes met hers. Calm, kind, yet carrying something that reached deeper than words. Maybe it was because she was tired of being invisible. Either way, she said softly, "Dinner sounds nice." As the door closed behind him, she realized her heart hadn't beaten this fast in years, and she didn't yet know. That one simple yes would change everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the quiet ache of being seen again. By late afternoon, the storm had disappeared completely, leaving the lake calm and shining beneath the soft October sun. Claire spent the morning tidying the house, not because it needed it, but because she couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's promise to return. Every time she caught herself glancing at the clock, she scolded herself silently. He was just a stranger, a traveler she had helped. That's all it should have been. But still, her heart beat faster at the thought of seeing him again. By evening, sky had turned a deep blue, the edges of the horizon glowing gold. She stood near the window, brushing her hair absently, when she saw headlights winding down the narrow road. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if she should pretend not to be home. But something inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time, told her to open the door. Ethan stood there, holding a paper bag and smiling with that same gentle warmth from the night before. "I kept my promise," he said. "Hope I'm not intruding again." Claire shook her head, smiling despite herself. "Come in." "You didn't have to bring anything. I owed you dinner," he said simply, stepping inside. "It's not much, but I tried to cook something decent at the inn nearby." He placed the bag on the table, 2 containers of pasta, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine. It wasn't fancy, but it felt real, thoughtful. Claire set out plates while Ethan lit a candle in the center of the table, laughing at his own attempt to make it look civilized. As they sat down to eat, the room filled with quiet conversation. They talked about simple things, the lake, the storm, his travels, her work as an interior designer. She told him how she'd once dreamed of starting her own studio, but life had slowly turned into routine. Daniel's job had taken priority, and she'd learned to let her dreams settle quietly at the bottom of her heart. Ethan listened with real attention. "You talk about your dreams like they still exist," he said gently. "That's something." She looked at him, surprised. "You think so?" "I know so," he said. "Some people forget how to even talk about what they love." His words hit deeper than she expected. Claire looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You sound like someone who's seen a lot of people forget." Ethan gave a small, knowing smile. "I've photographed people for a living. You start to notice when their eyes stop matching their smiles." There was a pause, long enough for the air to thicken between them. Claire didn't know what to say. She had never talked about her feelings with anyone outside her marriage. And yet, here she was, opening up to a man she had known less than a day. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was emotional, honest, and it scared her a little. The conversation shifted when he asked about the house. She told him how she and Daniel had bought it right after their wedding, full of plans for weekends at the lake and holidays by the fire. "We said it would be our forever place," she said softly. "But I guess forever became quieter than we thought." Ethan looked around the room, the old photographs on the walls, the half-burned candles. "The neatness that comes from habit, not joy. It's still beautiful," he said. "It just needs to be lived in again." His tone wasn't pitying. It was warm, sincere. Claire felt something stir inside her, a small reminder that she was still capable of feeling alive as they finished dinner. The fire flickered to life again. The warmth filled the room, blending with the soft hum of their voices. Ethan told her about his travels, the people he'd met, the places that had changed him. There was something poetic about the way he spoke, painting pictures with his words. Claire listened, completely absorbed. At one point, he took out his camera and showed her a few photos. Landscapes, mostly lakes, forests, faces of strangers caught mid-laughter. One image, though, caught her eye. It was a photo of a woman standing alone on a dock, her reflection shimmering in the water. She looked peaceful but distant, as if waiting for something that might never come. "She looks lonely," Claire said softly. "She was," Ethan replied. "But she didn't know how to say it, did you?" Claire asked. He nodded. "Sometimes we see things in others that we're afraid to see in ourselves." Their eyes met. For a few seconds, neither of them looked away. The wind brushed against the windows, and the soft creak of the house filled the quiet. Claire's chest felt tight, not with fear, but with recognition, like she had finally met someone who understood the silence she lived in. Ethan broke the gaze first, clearing his throat and smiling faintly. "I didn't mean to make things heavy. Sorry." "Don't be," she said quickly. It's nice to talk to someone who doesn't just nod and move on." He laughed softly. "Then I'm glad I crashed my car near your lake house." They shared a quiet smile. The night grew late, but neither wanted to end it. When the clock struck 10, Ethan stood reluctantly. "I should let you rest," he said. Claire nodded, though a small part of her didn't want him to leave. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for the company." He replied as he walked toward the door. She followed him, the air between them thick with something unspoken. He paused before opening it, looking at her once more. "You really have a beautiful view here," he said quietly, glancing past her to the lake glowing under the moonlight. "But I think you've forgotten to look at it." She looked at him, her throat tightening. "Maybe I have." He smiled, soft and sad. "You should start again." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and Claire stood there for a long time, her heart still racing. The house felt alive again, and for the first time in months she didn't dread the quiet. She walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit lake. The reflection shimmered, and she wondered if, maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't stopped moving after all. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the evening, the conversation, the laughter, the moments that felt like tiny sparks in the dark. Ethan wasn't like anyone she'd met in years. He didn't talk to her as if she were invisible or as if she had already been defined by her past. When morning came, the sky was clear and the air smelled of pine and dew. She brewed coffee and stood by the window, half expecting him to appear again. But hours passed and the road stayed empty, just when she convinced herself he'd moved on. There was a knock on the door. It was softer this time, almost uncertain. Claire's heart skipped. She opened the door and there he was, the same calm eyes, the same quiet smile. He held a camera in one hand and a small bunch of wildflowers in the other. "I was driving back into town," she said, "but I thought I'd stop by. These reminded me of your porch." "Ah," she laughed, surprised. "You picked flowers." He shrugged. "You let a stranger in from the rain? This is the least I could do." It was such a small gesture, but it warmed her deeply. She took the flowers, their petals still glistening with morning dew. "Thank you," she said. "They're beautiful. I wanted to see if you'd let me take a picture of the lake," he added quickly, as if trying to make his visit sound less personal. "The light's perfect today." Claire nodded. "Of course." They walked outside together. The air was crisp, the surface of the lake reflecting the golden morning light. Ethan raised his camera, capturing the scenery in a few soft clicks. Then he lowered it and looked at her. "Would you mind?" he asked gently, gesturing toward the dock. She hesitated. "You want me in the photo?" "Only if you want to be," he said. "You fit the place. It's like the lake's been waiting for you to notice it again." Her heart fluttered, but she agreed. She walked to the dock, the boards creaking beneath her feet. Ethan took a few photos quietly, the sound of the camera blending with the gentle lap of the water. When he finished, he smiled. "Perfect," he said softly. Claire felt the sun on her skin, the breeze on her face. She turned toward him. "You make people see themselves differently, don't you?" He looked at her for a moment. "Only if they let me." She didn't know what to say. There was an understanding in his words, a kindness that went beyond attraction. It was connection, real and deep. And as she watched him lower the camera, she realized that the line between gratitude and something more had quietly blurred. She didn't know where this would lead, or if it should lead anywhere at all. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel numb, and that, she thought, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The morning sun filtered softly through the thin curtains of the lake house, painting the wooden floor with golden stripes. Emily sat by the window, clutching a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Her mind was restless. The night before had been full of unspoken emotions. Not words, not actions, just silence that carried meaning. She had barely slept, turning over everything that had happened since Noah appeared on her doorstep. She looked out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. The reflection reminded her of herself, still on the surface, but full of undercurrents below. When she heard footsteps behind her, she didn't have to turn to know it was Noah. He had a quiet way of moving, thoughtful and unhurried. "Morning," he said softly. Standing by the table, "Morning," Emily replied. Trying to sound composed, he poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was gentle, filled with an understanding neither could explain. "I didn't sleep much," Noah said finally, smiling faintly. "Too many thoughts." "About what?" Emily asked, though she already knew. "About why I came here," he said, meeting her eyes, "and about why I can't seem to leave." Emily looked down at her coffee. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't want to show it. "You don't have to leave right away," she said. "You could stay until the storm clears. There's still some work to do around the house." He smiled, that quiet, grateful kind of smile that felt more like a thank you than words could express. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I could use the help." The truth was, she didn't want him to go. The house had felt too quiet before he came, too filled with memories of what used to be. With Noah there, it felt like someone had opened a window and let life back in. Over the next few days, they worked side by side, fixing loose panels, painting the porch, railing, cleaning the garden path that led down to the lake. Emily found herself laughing again, sometimes without realizing it. She'd forgotten what that felt like. Noah listened when she spoke, not just with his ears, but with his attention, as if her every word mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the lake into a sheet of gold, they sat together on the porch steps. A gentle breeze carried the smell of pine and water. "I haven't been this calm in years," Noah said, breaking the silence. Emily smiled softly. "Neither have I." He turned to her. "Do you ever think about starting over?" The question lingered in the air, tender and dangerous. She didn't answer right away. She thought of her husband, Mark, a man who had once filled her days with laughter and her nights with warmth, but whose presence had faded over time into distant routine. Their marriage had become something they both protected out of habit, not love. "I used to think it was too late," Emily said quietly, "that once you've built a life, you can't rebuild it again. But lately, I'm not so sure." Noah looked at her, his eyes deep and steady. "Sometimes it's not about rebuilding. Sometimes it's about remembering who you were before everything else got in the way." His words stayed with her long after he said them. The next morning, Emily received a message from Mark. He would be coming to the lake house for the weekend to talk. He had written. Her stomach tightened when she read it. They hadn't spoken properly in months. She told Noah later that day, her voice unsure. He listened quietly. "Then maybe it's time," he said softly. "You should talk to him. You both deserve that." Emily nodded, though a part of her didn't want the peace they'd built to break. When Mark arrived 2 days later, the air around the house changed. He was polite but distant, careful in his words, as if walking through a room full of fragile things. Noah stayed out of the way, spending most of the time near the lake or helping the old neighbor across the road. Still, Emily could feel the tension to worlds colliding quietly under the same roof. That evening, after Mark had unpacked and the sky turned gray with rain, Emily finally sat with him in the living room. The sound of the lake lapping against the dock filled the silence. Mark looked tired, his eyes dull with guilt. "Emily," he began, "I know things haven't been good. I've made mistakes. I thought maybe we could try again. Maybe we can fix this." She stared at him for a long moment. The words she had once longed to hear didn't bring relief. Instead, she felt something like sadness, not for him, but for what they had both lost. "I don't know if fixing it is what we need," she said gently. "Maybe we just need to stop pretending we're the same people we used to be." Mark looked down. "There's someone else, isn't there?" Emily froze. "No," she said quietly. "There isn't. But there is a part of me that wants to feel alive again. And I haven't felt that in a long time." He nodded slowly, and for the first time, she saw understanding in his eyes, the same kind of quiet surrender she'd seen in her own reflection many times before. That night, Mark left early, saying he needed time to think. When the door closed behind him, the house felt both emptier and freer. Emily walked down to the lake where Noah was standing, watching the sky clear after the rain. She stopped beside him, unsure what to say. "He left?" Noah asked softly. She nodded. "We both knew it was coming." For a moment they stood in silence, the water calm and silver under the moonlight. Then Noah turned to her. "What now?" Emily looked at him, the man who had appeared at her door as a stranger and somehow become a mirror for everything she'd buried inside. "Now," she said, smiling faintly, "I start over." He smiled back, the kind of smile that felt like a promise. In the days that followed, the lake house changed. It became a place not of memories but of beginnings. Emily painted the kitchen, filled the rooms with fresh flowers, and opened the windows wide every morning. Noah stayed a little longer, helping her finish the last repairs. Their conversations were lighter now, hopeful, even playful. One morning, as Noah packed his things into his truck, Emily walked up to him. "You're really leaving?" she asked. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on her. "For now. I need to figure some things out. But I'll be back if you want me to be." She smiled softly. "I think I do." He looked at her for a long moment, then said the words that would stay with her forever. "Then don't forget what it feels like to choose yourself." As his truck disappeared down the road, Emily stood on the porch, watching the sunlight dance on the lake. She felt something deep inside her shift, not loss, not longing, but peace. Months later, the lake house had become her new beginning. She hosted friends, wrote again, and found joy in small things. The smell of rain, the warmth of morning light, the quiet hum of her own thoughts. And every now and then, she'd catch sight of a truck in the distance, slowing near the gate, and her heart would remind her that some stories don't end. They simply find a new rhythm. Because sometimes a stranger doesn't come into your life to change who you are. Sometimes they come to remind you who you've always been. And on calm nights, when the wind whispered across the lake, Emily still heard his voice in her mind. Don't forget what it feels like to choose yourself. Right? It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was her truth. It was her freedom. It was the quiet beginning of everything she'd once been afraid to imagine.